Lawrence Greer was let go on a Thursday afternoon in front of 9 people by a woman who had already made the decision 2 weeks earlier and spent the intervening time building a paper trail thin enough to fold and thick enough to hold. Patricia Dunn, the regional director of Harwick Building Supply, did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She sat at the head of the table in the 4th-floor conference room with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing the outcome before the room fills, and she placed a single document on the table and slid it across the lacquered surface until it stopped in front of Lawrence's hands. It was a termination letter, effective end of business that day, signed and processed the previous Friday. Lawrence read it. He read the language carefully, not because he did not understand the words, but because he had been at Harwick for 11 years and some part of him needed a moment to recognize that 11 years could be reduced to a single page with 4 paragraphs and a date he had not been present to choose. The stated reason was performance inconsistency. He had been ranked in the top 12% of regional managers for 9 of those 11 years. The evaluation sitting in his file from 8 months earlier had described his territory as a model for sustainable margin growth. He did not say either of these things out loud. Patricia looked at him the way people look at a problem they have already stopped being curious about. Her voice, when it came, was unhurried and precise, and carried just enough volume to reach every person seated along both sides of that table. Lawrence, I'll be direct with you. The direction we're taking the division requires a different profile in this role. And candidly, given how this separation is being categorized, you're going to find that references from this organization won't be available in the way you might expect. She said it without emphasis. That was the part that stayed with him afterward. Not the words themselves, but the absence of hesitation around them. The decision had been made so far in advance that there was nothing left in it to feel. He looked at her. He did not argue. He did not ask her to explain the phrase different profile or identify what profile he had apparently failed to become. He folded the letter once, picked up his portfolio from the chair beside him, and stood. He said thank you in the way a man says it when he means nothing by it, and walked out of the conference room without looking back at the table or the people seated along it. The drive home took 40 minutes. He sat in traffic on the interstate with the radio off and his hands at 10 and 2, and thought about the fact that his son Owen's soccer registration payment was due on the 15th, and that he had not yet called the insurance company back about the renewal, and that the refrigerator had been making a noise for 3 weeks that he had been putting off looking into. He thought about these things because thinking about them was easier than thinking about the other thing. The apartment was quiet when he got there. Owen was at school. Lawrence set his portfolio on the kitchen table, poured a glass of water, and stood at the counter drinking it. He looked at the permission slip on the refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a fish that Owen had picked out at a gas station 2 summers ago. Class trip to the Natural History Museum, $8. He signed it and put it back under the fish magnet. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a while. The weeks that followed had the texture of something wearing down slowly and without drama. Lawrence sent his resume to 7 companies in the first 2 weeks. He had managed a 6-county territory producing $14 million in annual revenue. He had built supplier relationships that had held through 2 supply disruptions and a market correction. He knew distribution, procurement, contractor account management, and the particular skill of keeping a sales team motivated through quarters where the numbers do not cooperate. None of this appeared to matter to the companies that responded. 2 responded. One said the position had been filled internally. The other scheduled a call, asked him where he was coming from, and when he said Harwick Building Supply, there was a pause on the line of the specific kind that contains more information than whatever comes after it. The interviewer said they would be in touch and was not. He understood what was happening. Patricia Dunn had not been speaking loosely in that conference room. She had been describing a mechanism she had already set in motion. The savings were enough to cover about 5 months if he was careful. Owen was 10. He had a school trip coming up and a birthday in November and a pair of cleats that were starting to separate at the toe. Lawrence bought him new cleats the week after the termination. He did not tell Owen why he was home earlier than usual on Thursdays now, or why he was making dinner every night instead of picking something up. He said he was between projects. Owen accepted this with the particular equanimity of a child who senses something without wanting to make his father explain it. Lawrence kept his evenings quiet. After Owen went to bed, he sat at the desk in the 2nd bedroom he used as an office and reviewed job boards with the focused attention of a man trying to convince himself that patience is a strategy. On a Tuesday night, sometime in the 3rd week, he opened a tab he had bookmarked 18 months earlier during a market research project at Harwick. It was a listing aggregator for commercial real estate in distressed or transitional categories. He had bookmarked it because he liked understanding markets the way other people like solving puzzles. It was not something he had ever acted on. It was just a way of thinking. He scrolled without any particular destination. There were vacant strip mall anchors and shuttered light industrial buildings and a row of agricultural processing facilities in 3 counties that had been sitting unsold for years. He was about to close the tab when something near the bottom of the page made him stop. Kellum Yard and Supply Depot, 3.8 acres, former building materials distribution center, covered receiving bay, truck access from 2 directions, partial inventory management infrastructure still in place, listed 27 months, reduced 3 times. Located in Delwood, 41 miles northeast of the metro area. The listing notes were brief and did not make the property sound appealing. Outdated systems, too far from current contractor corridors. Carrying costs on a structure that needs significant roof repair and electrical upgrade. Lawrence pulled up a second tab and opened the County Infrastructure Planning Archive that his Harwick territory had overlapped during the Northern Reach expansion study 2 years earlier. The one that Patricia Dunn had decided was outside the current strategic window and shelved. He found the revised corridor projections for the Northeastern Supply Corridor, which showed a planned state highway extension and 2 new commercial zone designations scheduled for completion in a 4 to 6 year window. He put the 2 maps side by side. Delwood was 41 miles out today. In 4 years, possibly 5, that highway extension would make it 22. The 2 new commercial designations fell within 8 miles of Kellum Yard on both sides. What was currently a long drive to nowhere was, on paper and on a specific timeline, the center of something that had not been built yet. Lawrence sat with that for a long time. He closed the laptop. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about the reason Patricia Dunn had given for his termination, the phrase that had never made sense to him because the numbers had never given it a reason to. He thought about Owen's cleats sitting by the door. He thought about the fact that the savings account had a countdown on it that he was tracking with a spreadsheet he kept minimized on his desktop. Then he thought about a 3.8-acre building materials distribution center that had been sitting on the market for 27 months because nobody had run the maps side by side and been willing to wait. He opened the laptop again. Theo Hartwell had spent 34 years in commercial real estate before deciding that he was done with offices but not with deals, and the distinction mattered to him. Lawrence had met him once at a regional contractors expo 6 years earlier, had kept his contact in a folder he labeled People Who Have Actually Done Things, and had never had occasion to use it until a Wednesday morning when he typed out a message and sent it before he could talk himself out of it. They met at a coffee shop 3 days later. Theo ordered tea, read the menu from top to bottom despite clearly knowing it, and said very little until Lawrence finished laying out the Kellum analysis on the table between them, the location data, the corridor projections, the timeline, the asking price, which was the kind of number that sounds almost reasonable when you understand why everyone else had walked away from it. Theo read without speaking. He looked at the maps. He looked at the projection data from the county archive. He set the pages down and looked at Lawrence. Who else has looked at this? Nobody who ran both maps. Theo picked up his tea. He looked out the window. He looked at the papers one more time. The roof alone is going to take 3 months and run over whatever estimate you get. The electrical has to be brought up to current commercial code before you can do anything with the receiving bay. And Delwood is not a name that makes a banker move quickly. I know. The corridor timeline is 4 to 6 years. That's a long time to carry a property at thin margins hoping the state builds a road on schedule. I know that too. Theo set down his cup and looked at Lawrence in the way people look when they are deciding whether something is interesting or inadvisable, and the answer is sometimes both. Here's what I'll tell you, he said. Most people who look at distressed commercial property in secondary locations are either desperate or they don't understand what they're looking at. You don't look desperate and you clearly understand what you're looking at. He paused. That either means you're right or it means you're wrong in a way that's going to be expensive to learn. I think I'm right. I believe you. Theo folded his hands on the table. I'll come in as a limited partner, enough to cover the electrical upgrade and 6 months of operating reserve. You manage everything. You run the operation, I stay in the background. He looked at Lawrence steadily. But I need you to understand that if the corridor slips 2 years, we both feel it. If I'm wrong, Lawrence said, I'll own it completely. You already do, Theo said. That's why I'm saying yes. The closing happened on a Friday afternoon in a title office on the 2nd floor of a building in the kind of neighborhood where the parking lot is also shared with a tax preparation service and a place that sells insurance in 3 languages. The seller's representative was a man named Aldous who seemed relieved in the specific way of someone who had shown the same property many more times than he wanted to remember. Lawrence signed where indicated and initialed where indicated and did not rush any of it. Owen was sitting against the wall in a chair that was too large for him, working on a drawing with a pen he had borrowed from the receptionist. Lawrence glanced at him twice during the signing. Owen was drawing something large and complicated, a building it appeared, with a road in front of it and a truck pulling in. In the parking lot, Owen looked up. "Is that ours now?" "It's ours," Lawrence said. "It looked kind of broken." "It is, we're going to fix it." Owen considered this with the seriousness of a 10-year-old who has learned that his father means what he says. "What if it can't be fixed?" "Everything can be fixed," Lawrence said. "The question is whether the thing underneath is worth fixing." "Is it?" "I think it is." Owen nodded and got in the car. The 14 months that followed were not the kind that fear easy telling. They were long and specific and had no audience and no clean milestones and very little about them that felt like progress on any given day. Lawrence hired a crew of 5. He paid them every Friday without exception, including the Fridays when doing so meant he was eating sandwiches in the Kellum Yard side office instead of driving home, because the commute burned fuel he was tracking in a budget that had no room for sentiment. The crew noticed. They stayed on when others would have moved to easier jobs. They worked with the kind of care that comes from knowing the person running the job is not pretending. The roof came first. 6 weeks over budget required an additional structural inspection halfway through when the crew found water damage that didn't show in the original assessment. Then the electrical, which took 10 weeks and a complete panel replacement and 2 visits from the county inspector before it passed. Then the receiving bay doors, 3 of them, which required custom fabrication because the original hardware was no longer made. Lawrence learned things during that period he had not expected to learn. How to read a load-bearing inspection report without an engineer translating every third sentence, which materials suppliers answered the phone on the day they said they would, and which ones needed a payment hold to stay honest. How to write a lease agreement for a month-to-month commercial tenant that protected both parties without a lawyer doing every line. How the property felt on a Tuesday morning when the light came across the receiving floor in a way that reminded him of why he had seen something in it that nobody else had stayed long enough to see. By month 10, Kellum had 2 active tenants, a mid-size contractor supply company and a small regional equipment rental outfit, both looking for staging space close enough to the work but not priced like it. Neither contract was large. Together they covered operating costs and left a margin that was not a victory but was evidence. It was proof that the math worked at a baseline, and baseline was what he needed to show what came next. He received a call in month 12 from a former Harwick territory manager named Gil who had kept in touch the way people keep in touch after a corporate shakeout, periodic check-ins that say more by what they don't explain than by what they do. Gil mentioned, in the way of someone passing along information without wanting to be quoted on it, that Harwick had restructured its northern operations and was now in the market for third-party staging partnerships along the northeastern corridor to support a contractor outreach expansion. Lawrence listened to this without responding beyond what was polite. He thanked Gil for calling. He went back to reviewing the second bay renovation plans. The defamation started in month 13. Lawrence did not realize what it was at first. A tenant he had been in conversation with for 3 weeks went quiet and then sent a brief email saying they had decided to go another direction. A week later, a contractor referral that had been warm for a month stopped responding. He might have attributed both to ordinary attrition, except that in the 3rd week a supplier he had worked with for years called him personally to ask if there was some kind of licensing issue he had heard about associated with Kellum Yard. There was not. Lawrence did not know of any licensing issue because no licensing issue existed. He started asking careful questions. Within 10 days he had traced the outline of it. Someone was circulating information to regional contractors and supply contacts that Kellum Yard had failed a commercial safety inspection and that its owner had misrepresented credentials during the licensing process. The claims had the texture of rumor, passed casually, attributed to no specific source, difficult to address directly because no one wanted to say clearly where they had heard it. Both claims were false. Lawrence sat in the Kellum side office the evening he confirmed the scope of it. He did not make calls in that moment that he would have needed to walk back. He sat at the desk and looked out the window at the receiving floor and the repaired bay doors and the floor he had resurfaced and the electrical panel that had taken 10 weeks to pass inspection, and thought about what it had taken to build this from the condition it had been in when he signed the closing documents. He called Theo. "Someone is running a reputation play," he said. Theo was quiet for a moment. "How wide?" "Wide enough. I've lost 2 prospects and 1 warm referral in 3 weeks, and a supplier I trust called me about a licensing issue that doesn't exist. Can you trace it?" "I think so. That's why I'm calling Miriam next." Miriam Alt had spent 22 years as a commercial litigation attorney and had the specific temperament of someone who had seen every variation of this exact situation and found none of them surprising and all of them actionable. She listened to Lawrence's account without interrupting. She asked 4 questions, all of them precise. She told him she needed 72 hours. She called back in 54. She had traced the origin of the rumor to a communications vendor whose account had been opened with contact information and payment details that linked back to an entity with a Harwick Building Supply billing designation. It was not ambiguous. "You have a defamation case," Miriam said. "Clean and documented." "That's not the first move," Lawrence said. "I didn't think it was. What do you want to do?" "I want to talk to someone at Harwick who is not Patricia Dunn." Miriam paused. "That's a narrower set of options than it sounds. I know who to call." Frederick Oakes had been on the Harwick board for 14 years. He was not a sentimental man, and he was not a man who responded well to appeals framed around feelings. What he was, and what Lawrence had learned from 2 years of working adjacent to board-level decisions at Harwick, was a man who was genuinely interested in financial exposure that had not been properly disclosed to him. Lawrence did not write to him as someone who had been wronged. He wrote as an analyst who had identified a material liability and a compounding strategic risk. He attached 19 pages, no cover letter, no biography, just the documentation, the defamation trace, the corridor projection data, the Kellum financials, and a cost differential analysis showing what the northeastern expansion would cost Harwick if it passed on the optimal staging partner in favor of a less capable facility due to a decision that originated from an undisclosed conflict. He sent it on a Tuesday evening and went to bed. Sylvia was the one who changed things inside the building. She had been at Harwick for 6 years in a finance and operations analysis role. She was not someone Lawrence had worked closely with during his time at the company, though he had sat across from her in a regional review meeting twice, and both times had noticed that she was the person in the room most likely to say the accurate thing at the cost of the comfortable one. She was thorough and she was careful, and she had built a small professional reputation for presentations that did not contain anything she could not defend in detail. When Frederick Oakes initiated a quiet internal review of the Northeastern expansion procurement process, Sylvia was pulled to support the analysis. She reviewed the staging partner evaluation framework. She reviewed the shortlist. She reviewed the scoring against the stated criteria. Kellum Yard was not on the shortlist. It had been excluded without a formal evaluation. She pulled the corridor mapping data. She pulled the infrastructure projections. She looked at the Kellum financials through the documentation Lawrence had sent to the board. She spent a weekend working through it at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee that went cold twice. By Sunday evening, she had run the numbers 4 ways. All 4 came out the same. The optimal staging partner for the Northeastern expansion, by every metric the company had approved in its evaluation framework, was a facility that had been excluded from consideration through a process she could not document as legitimate. She also found the defamation trace. She sat with all of this for 2 days. She had a meeting with Frederick Oakes on Thursday morning. She could walk in and give a standard update. She could present the clean numbers and let someone else draw the conclusions. She had spent 6 years being careful, and careful had served her. She thought about what it meant to have the correct information and choose not to say it plainly. On Thursday morning, Sylvia stood in front of the Harwick board review session and gave the most precise presentation of her career. She walked through the scoring framework. She walked through what Kellum Yard would have scored had it been evaluated. She showed the annual cost differential between selecting the optimal partner and the current alternative. The number was significant, and it was compounding. Then she walked through the defamation documentation. She did not editorialize. She did not use the word deliberate or targeted or retaliation. She presented the documentation and let the board read what it said. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where something has been confirmed rather than revealed. Frederick Oakes looked down the table. "Patricia," he said, and his voice was even and without performance. "Is there something you'd like to address before we move to procedure?" Patricia Dunn sat with the posture of someone who had prepared for this and was no longer sure that the preparation was sufficient. She said that the decisions regarding partner selection had been made with the company's strategic interests in mind, and that she welcomed a thorough review of the process. Frederick nodded once, as if he had expected that answer and found it adequate to confirm what it confirmed. Patricia Dunn was placed on administrative leave pending a full internal review by the end of that afternoon. It was processed with the efficiency of a decision that had already been made before anyone in the room said it out loud. She left the building at 5:12. Harwick's Northeastern Expansion Partnership was reopened to evaluation. Kellum Yard was assessed formally for the first time. It came back as the top-rated facility in the corridor by a margin that was not small. Lawrence signed the contract on a Monday afternoon. He did not mark it publicly. He called Theo, who said very little, which was what Theo always said when something had turned out exactly the way he had said it would, and he wanted to give the other person the dignity of owning the moment without being reminded. He took Owen out to dinner that night. Owen ordered the burger he always ordered, ate most of it, and then asked what they were celebrating. "We're not celebrating," Lawrence said. "We're marking something. What's the difference? Celebrating is when something ends. Marking is when something begins." Owen thought about this the way he thought about everything his father said that he wasn't sure he understood but suspected was true. "What's beginning?" "The part I built this for," Lawrence said. Owen accepted this and went back to his burger. Miriam sent her formal documentation to the contractors and supply contacts who had received the defamation campaign and published a factual correction through to regional trade publications. Lawrence did not give interviews. He did not issue a public statement about Patricia Dunn. He returned to the work of running a facility that now had 4 active tenants and a long-term anchor partnership with a regional supply chain that would take the northeastern corridor seriously because the road data had finally caught up to what the maps had shown 2 years earlier. Sylvia left Harwick 6 weeks after the board session. Her resignation was accepted without negotiation, which she had expected. She had spent the weeks between doing the kind of thinking that comes after you have made a choice and need to understand what it says about you going forward. She reached out to Lawrence by email 3 weeks after her last day. It was professional and brief, the kind of message a person writes when they want to say something and are not sure how much room they have to say it. She mentioned she was available for independent financial analysis and operational consulting. She said she had found the work on the corridor projections genuinely interesting and that she did not leave interesting problems alone easily. At the end of the email, she wrote one sentence that had taken her longer than everything else. She said she was sorry she had not said something sooner. She did not explain what she meant by sooner. She did not need to. Lawrence replied within the hour. He said there was expansion work at Kellam that she might find interesting if she wanted to come and see the facility. She came on a Wednesday morning, 3 months after the board session, on a day when the light came across the receiving floor in a way that made the new bay doors look like they had always been there. She carried a folder and a coffee, and she walked in the way of someone who had made a decision about where they were walking before they arrived. Owen was there because school was out for a teacher workday, and Lawrence had not found someone to watch him. He was sitting in the side office with a set of building blocks arranged on the floor in a structure that was clearly meant to represent something specific, though what it was remained unclear. He looked up when Sylvia came in and studied her for a moment with the directness of children who have not yet learned to disguise their curiosity. "Are you the one who helped?" he asked. Sylvia looked at him. "Owen," Lawrence said from across the room. "I'm just asking." "Yes," Sylvia said, "I helped." Owen considered this. "Good," he said, and went back to his building. They spent 2 hours at the desk going through the folders she had brought. Phase 2 was already on paper, an additional 2.2 acres on the adjacent parcel that had come up in a private listing, an extended receiving capacity, a covered outdoor staging area for materials that could not be kept under roof but needed to be off the ground. Lawrence had also had 3 preliminary conversations with a pharmaceutical supply intermediary through Harwick's referral network who was looking for a northeastern hub with documented environmental controls. Sylvia looked at the numbers and asked the kind of questions that went directly to the center of each issue without circling it first. Owen appeared in the doorway around noon and announced that he was hungry, which he announced with the authority of someone who considered this a relevant contribution to the conversation. "There's a place 2 blocks down," Sylvia said. "I saw it coming in. Looked like sandwiches." Lawrence looked at his son. "Sound good?" Owen shrugged in the way that meant yes. They walked out into the afternoon, Lawrence and Sylvia and Owen between them, and Owen asked Sylvia a series of questions about her job that she answered directly and without talking down to him, which he seemed to appreciate. He asked what a financial analyst did, and she said it was mostly looking at numbers until the numbers told you something true. He said he was good at numbers. She said that was useful. He thought about this and decided it was a satisfactory exchange. They ate outside on a bench in front of the sandwich place. The conversation moved away from work at some point and into other things. Nothing that needed to be recorded or decided, just the ease of people who had been through something and come out knowing what each other was made of. Walking back, Owen reached up and took Lawrence's hand. After half a block, he reached up with his other hand towards Sylvia. She looked down at him. He was already looking somewhere else, interested in something across the street, a delivery truck backing into a loading dock with the particular concentration of a large vehicle doing a careful thing. She took his hand and they walked the last half-block to the Kellum Yard entrance that way. Inside, Lawrence stood at the window that looked out over the receiving floor. The Harwick staging trucks were running their afternoon cycle, arriving and loading and pulling out through the access road that ran northeast toward the corridor, where the state construction equipment had been grading the highway extension for 3 months, and would not stop until it reached the interchange that most of the regional market had not yet adjusted their projections to account for. He had bought a property that 27 months of listing had rendered invisible. He had built it back to function in the time it takes most people to decide whether they want to. The trucks pulled out of the receiving bay one after another, clean and on schedule, heading northeast on a road that was getting shorter by the week. Lawrence watched the last one clear the gate. He looked at it until it was small and then gone. Then he turned back to the desk and the Phase 2 drawings and went back to work.